We got through his getting married and having the wedding feast, and then the whole riddle thing, and Samson gets mad and he goes off and kills 30 Philistines so that he can basically pay off the bet that he lost. And so now we get to chapter 15. I want to read the first 2 verses. Later on, during the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat as a gift and visited his wife. "I want to go to my wife in her room," he said, but her father would not let him enter. "I was sure you hated her," her father said, "so I gave her to one of the men who accompanied you. Isn't her younger sister more beautiful than she is? Why not take her instead?" This Samson is one of those characters that we look at in the Bible and we just kind of wonder time after time, what are you thinking? Well, now Samson has left his wife, basically left her all mad. He was in a huff. And he just took off, leaves his wife. And the father does what would seem natural, what would seem, I guess in their culture, would seem natural, would seem right. He marries off the daughter to another person. Now in our culture, we look at it, it just doesn't make any sense to us. To understand it, you have to put yourself into that culture that we're talking about. Because for a woman not to be married, to have had her husband leave her, placed her into a social category that was way down. And it left her vulnerable to never being able to be married. Now in our culture, never being married, it's okay, that's acceptable. In their culture, for a woman to have not been married would mean that when she was older, she would have nobody to care for her, nobody to provide for her. And so it would leave her in extreme danger of dying destitute. And so the dad does really what seems like a good thing to do. But Samson, after a while, decides, I'm going to go visit my wife. And he goes down and he says that he takes a young goat with him as a gift. And I read that, and my first thought was, what? Could he not find a vacuum cleaner? I mean, how many wives would you just be so excited if your husband comes after not visiting you for a while and says, "Hey, honey, here's a gift," and it's a baby goat? I don't think many of the wives would probably be going, "Yeah, you better go around and hit the flower store, buddy, or the chocolate store." I don't know why he brings her a goat. Evidently, that must have been an acceptable gift in their culture. I don't really understand it, but that's what he did. And he thinks he's doing something really good. And he gets there, and the father says, "Samson, I thought you hated her. And so I gave her to somebody else." Now we know Samson's character. We've looked at his character. How do you think Samson is going to react? Is Samson just going to say, "Oh, okay," and turn around and go home? Or is there going to be some bad things happening? And as you think about that, think about yourself. When people wrong you, how do you respond? When people do something that seems to you to have wronged you, to have harmed you, how do you respond to that? And how would God want us to respond? Let's continue to worship. Stand as we continue to sing. Please be seated. Now, if you're really kind of wondering why on earth a young goat would have been an acceptable gift to give to his wife, again, you have to kind of remind yourself of the culture. They didn't have a nice fancy steakhouse, so Samson couldn't come in and take his wife out to Ruth's Chris Steakhouse or Daniel's Broiler or any of those. They just didn't have them. And so and the people of that area did not eat a lot of meat. And so his bringing this young goat that he was planning to cook and eat. Sorry, Laura. They were planning to cook and eat this goat. That was a wonderful gift to his wife. Even though, we laugh about it, it seems kind of weird and strange for us. It was actually a very appropriate gift to give. So how is Samson going to respond that his father-in-law has taken his wife and given her to another person? We'll go back to Judges chapter 15. We'll pick up the story in verse 3. Samson said to them, "This time I won't be responsible when I harm the Philistines." So he went out and caught 300 foxes. He took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. Then he ignited the torches and released the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the piles of grain and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. You know, as we think about this story, one of the things I think we have to kind of keep in mind is Samson's response every time. I'm going to tell you a story a little later in the message of how somebody dealt with somebody who was a bully. And in some ways you may think, well, granted, it's the same thing, and you're telling that story as an appropriate response, and you're saying that Samson was wrong. Well, there's a big difference between them, and hopefully you'll catch it when I tell that story. But Samson goes out because his father-in-law has wronged him, in Samson's eyes. I really look at it and don't know that his father-in-law wronged him at all, but in Samson's eyes, his father-in-law has wronged him, and so he's going to pay him back. And the way he pays his father-in-law back is he burns up all of the Philistines in that area, burns up all of their crops. It was the wheat harvest. And so they had all of their wheat was either ready to harvest, or it had already been bundled up and was maybe waiting in the fields, and it was standing out there, and he burns all of it. And you know, when you see this story, and again, we have to go back and remind ourselves again, Samson had been born and been appointed by God to be a judge of the nation, to be a deliverer of the nation, to deliver them from the Philistines. And if you remember back in the previous chapter, that whole idea of Samson marrying this Philistine woman, remember that one little passage of a verse, one little part of a verse that said, this had been ordained by God. I think it was ordained by God or planned by God. It was in God's plan because it would give the Israelites a reason to go against the Philistines. He was seeking an occasion to remove the Philistines as the rulers over Israel. And so Samson, as that man who had been appointed by God, should have gathered Israel's troops and should have said to them, listen, they have wronged me. Let's go and attack. But instead, Samson strikes out on his own. And all he really does is just wreak havoc. He somehow manages to gather 300 foxes, or some would say jackals. We don't really know which exactly, but 300 animals, ties their tails together, puts a torch in, and sends them out. And you can imagine the foxes are running everywhere, and it just catches everything on fire. And so the Philistines' wheat harvest is wiped out. But notice what Samson says. Go back to verse 3. This time I won't be responsible when I harm the Philistines. Basically, he's saying, I'm going to be innocent. Yes, I am about to go wreak major economic disaster upon these people, but I'll be blameless. As Samson said for himself, not my fault. They made me do it. Now, I don't know, any of us that are parents have never heard that, right? Any of us that you're not parents or your kids aren't that old yet, you never said that to your parents, right? It's not my fault. They made me do it. We hear that all the time. Samson tries to use it because he thinks, I'm just practicing lex talionis, the law of eye for an eye. Now, I don't know how Samson can think that him losing his wife and having her married off after he had already just basically abandoned her for we don't know how long. I don't know how he thinks that that is just the same as wreaking economic disaster upon this entire region of the Philistines. I don't know. But he does it, and he feels righteous. What are the Philistines going to think? Read verse 6. Then the Philistines asked, "Who did this?" They were told, "It was Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because he has taken Samson's wife and given her to another man." So the Philistines went to her and her father and burned them to death. Sounds harsh, doesn't it? The Philistines are angry. They're ticked off. And their response just simply escalates the violence, but not in the way that we would think at first. We would think they would go after Samson, right? Samson's the one that did this. Let's go get Samson. No, they go to this man, and they take this man and his daughter, and they burn them to death. I got to tell you, I don't understand that. I don't understand how that's right. It's what they did. It seems outlandish. Here was a man who really was innocent. He was doing only what he thought was best for his daughter. And again, us fathers, don't we always want to do what is best for our children? He is protecting his daughter. She's been abandoned. So he marries her off, and now she's going to be taken care of. And because of that, they're burned to death. Well, Samson responds to that. His response, as you go back through this, his response the first time, he kills 30. They get mad. He gives his daughter away, or his wife away. They come back. Now he's wreaked economic disaster. All that does is get his former wife and her father burned to death. And do you see this escalating pattern of violence? And so we go, okay, hopefully it's going to end right now. But verse 7 says, Samson told them, "Because you did this, I swear that I won't rest until I have taken vengeance on you." He tore them limb from limb with a great slaughter. And he went down and stayed in the cave at the rock of Etam. Well, Samson says, "I'm going to take vengeance. You've killed my father-in-law and my wife. Now I'm going to take vengeance on you, and I'm going to pay you back." And again, he says, "I'll be blameless in what I'm going to do." Well, the Bible tells us in Romans chapter 12, verse 19, it says this, "Friends, do not avenge yourselves. Instead, leave room for his wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance belongs to me. I will repay.'" Samson says, "I am going to take vengeance." But he does it by himself. Again, here's another opportunity that Samson could have gathered the army of Israel and said, "It is time to remove the Philistines. It's what God has wanted us to do. It's time to do it. We've got the reason now." No, instead, he strikes out on his own. And to understand how incredibly powerful Samson is, by himself, he goes out and he has such a great slaughter of Philistines in a battle that the way that it literally reads in these verses is it reads leg on thigh. And what it does is it gives the idea that there were so many bodies of the Philistines left on the battlefield that they were just piled on top of each other in just this massive pile of bodies. And so the people would look and they just would say looked like it was just leg on thigh, just stacked up. And you couldn't even tell. The slaughter was so massive. And again, we go, how can that be right? How can this be acceptable? Well, Samson thinks now it's over. They wronged me, I paid them back. They wronged me again, I've paid them back again. And so now it's going to be done. Well, you and I know better than that. Because you see, when we take vengeance into our own hands, it never accomplishes anything. Now, do we have the right to defend ourselves? Yes, we do. But exacting vengeance doesn't accomplish anything except for further violence. I told you I was going to tell you a story. Well, a few years ago, my son, Zach, was being bullied. He had a kid, little brat, that was really just giving him a hard time. I guess he was a brat, okay? He was. He was giving Zach a hard time and, just antagonizing him, calling him names and all this. And it was beginning to bother Zach. And so Zach comes home, finally tells his mom what's going on. And when Denise came to me and told me what was going on, so I sat down, I talked with Zach, and, we talked about it, and I was like, okay, Zach, what's going on? And he started telling me, this guy was calling him names and stuff. And I said, Zach, here's how you're going to have to handle it. I said, the next time he calls you names, I said, you got to get all that courage. I said, you can't be emotional when you do this. So you just got to stare him in the face, look him right in the eyes, and say, listen, when you're ready to back up your words, go ahead and throw the first punch. And Zach looked at me, and I go, and when he does, Zach, defend yourself. And Zach was like, but Dad, they'll kick me out of school. And I said, yeah, I know. That's the rules they have now. I said, when I come to the school and they've kicked you out, I'm just going to ask them, did Zach throw the first punch? I said, now if they tell me that yes, you did, I said, you're going to be in big trouble. So, but if all you did was defend yourself, protect yourself, then you're not going to be in trouble. And you notice the difference? You see, when Zach stood up to this kid, he was telling that person, you attack me, I'm going to defend myself. Leave me alone until you're ready. Funny thing is, when Zach stood up to the kid, I asked him a couple days later, did it happen? Yeah, what'd you say? I told him what you told me to say. Was he done anything else? No. Lesson for bullies. Most of the time, if you just stand up to them, they'll walk away. But Samson, instead of standing up to the people that had wronged him, the immediate people, Samson goes out and attacks somebody else thinking, well, if I go attack somebody else, it'll take care of it. Really, all it did is it made Samson feel better. But isn't that what we do a lot of times? You attack me, and instead of me going back at you, I'm going to go attack somebody else because I feel better about myself. Because I may be scared to take on you, but I can go take on somebody else. And that's what Samson does. Is he escalates that violence and he goes out and he attacks people. And really, this whole story is just simply about that escalating violence. That when we say, I am going to take vengeance, it doesn't accomplish anything. Because God himself says, vengeance is mine. Sometimes when people wrong us, the only answer is to just take it. Not saying don't defend yourself, just as I taught Zach. It's okay to defend yourself. But Samson really wasn't defending himself. He was attacking other people and harming other people. This whole story, if Samson would have just said, you know what, I'm going to defend myself, but I'm not going to harm others. I'm not going to take vengeance because vengeance belongs to God, the story would have ended differently. I want to go to verses 9 through 14. The Philistines went up, camped in Judah, and raided Lehi. So the men of Judah said, why have you attacked us? They replied, we have come to arrest Samson and pay him back for what he did to us. And you notice what's happened? Now the Philistines are returning, and they're saying, we're going to pay you back, Samson. And now not only is Samson, it's still not even Samson that's going to suffer. It is the people of this area. Now the Philistines have come in, they're raiding the area, and the people of Judah are suffering. They've done nothing. And they're suffering. Then 3,000 men of Judah went to the cave at the rock of Etam, and they asked Samson, don't you realize that the Philistines rule over us? What have you done to us? I have done to them what they did to me, he answered. Again, Samson says, I'm innocent. Eye for the eye. I've done nothing wrong. They said to him, we've come to arrest you and hand you over to the Philistines. Then Samson told them, swear to me that you yourselves won't kill me. No, they said, we won't kill you, but we will tie you up securely and hand you over to them. So they tied him up with 2 new ropes and led him away from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came to meet him, shouting. The Spirit of the Lord took control of him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like burnt flax, and his bonds fell off his wrists. The story goes on that he killed in that day 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. As Samson has fled, and isn't it telling that when the tribe of Judah comes, they don't look at Samson and say, you know, Samson, we see how incredibly strong you are. We've heard the stories. We know what you can do. And Samson, we want to make you our ruler. We want to make you our judge, the chief of us, the boss man. We will become, you be the commander of the army, and we will follow you, and we will fight with you, and we'll throw off these Philistines. You see, Samson hasn't built ties with his community. He hasn't served his community in such a way that they would look at him. They just come to arrest him. Samson, the man that should have been the one to lead the nation in an uprising against the Philistines, is now being arrested and having to say to them, to the people of Judah, I'll go as long as you promise not to kill me yourselves. And they say, we won't kill you. So he's brought back to the Philistines. The Philistines think they have finally captured their tormentor. And they rejoice. If you know, we read the story, he kills 1,000 of them. And you hear this whole thing and you just go, what's the point? Have you noticed something or someone that seems to be absent from this entire story? There is someone from this entire story that's just missing. And that someone is God. You see, he's there, but Samson has forgotten about God. In this entire story, there's not once when the father-in-law gives his bride away, Samson doesn't go to God and say, God, this is wrong. He goes off and burns the harvest. When they burn his bride and his father-in-law to death, Samson doesn't go back and say, God, this is wrong. What do I do? He runs off and kills a bunch of people. The only time that we have in this entire chapter that Samson prays comes a few verses down. And it's not in the song. Samson sings a song of praise, of glory to himself after he kills 1,000. He sings this song about how incredible and how amazing he is. The only time he talks to God is when he needs something. He's thirsty. And he says, God, I have done all of these things for you. I'm sure God just kind of maybe listened to him and thought, yeah, whatever. You see, I don't think Samson did any of those things for God. He did them for himself. But he says, God, I've done all these things for you, and you're going to now let me die of thirst out here? Oh, poor me. Amazingly, God answers. Samson doesn't deserve what he gets. Samson does not deserve for I think it says that the rock split open and water comes out. Samson doesn't deserve that. All Samson really deserves is for God to look down on him and say, whatever, go find your own water, buddy. But out of his unbelievable mercy, God provides the water. I don't understand why God does it. Except I look at my own life, and I look at people around me, and I realize how many times do we do everything for ourselves? How many times do we forget God? How many times do we see hard tasks and we just, that American way, man, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We're going to take care of it. And never once do we stop and say, God, help me, until we just get desperate. How many times when we have done something amazing, when we have accomplished great things, how many times do we sit back and go, wow, God, thank you. I know I couldn't have done that on my own, and thank you, God, for what you did. Samson doesn't. I think Samson is a lot like us. And so while we look and we say, God, why would you give him water? He doesn't deserve it. And God would have to respond back to us, why have I given you anything? You don't deserve it either. And we don't. But God loves us. We have a merciful and a gracious God. Samson could have been one of the greatest military leaders in the history of Israel. But he wasn't. He was a great individual champion. But he could have been more, because he didn't live for God. How about you? Do you live for God, or do you live for you? Turn on your connection card. First thing I have there is, I will learn to control my passions. We've seen that the last 2 weeks. You're going to see it one more time next week. Because again, the Samson story is all about the fact that Samson never learned to control his passions. He never learned to make worshiping God and glorifying God and serving God number one in his life, and make everything else subject to that. And because of that, all of these other things have happened in his life. And you and I will be the same if we do not learn to subject our desires, our passions to the will of God, and to make worshiping him and serving him number one in our life. If we don't get to that point where we make our motto loving God, loving each other, loving our community, if we don't get to the place where that becomes everything for us, then we're going to end up like Samson. And sure, you may do some really good things, but you could have done so much more, individually and as a church. The second, I will let God gain vengeance, not do it myself. I'm not saying don't defend yourself. I'm saying don't go out and exact vengeance, because God says that's his job. And third, I will work under God's plan for my life. Man, if Samson had committed himself to doing just that, much of Israel's history might have been different. How about you? If you will go and live your life focused on what does God want me to do? Your history, your family's history, your city's history could be different. You want a purpose in life? God has given all of us a purpose. And that is to make him known, to glorify him. And it is the single greatest purpose that any of us could have in our life. Live it for him. Live your life for him, not for you. Let's pray together.